Amelia Island invites you to enjoy specialty dishes and drinks plus gourmet foodie events from January 17th to 26th during the annual Amelia Island Restaurant Week. Details at ameliaisland.com/yummy. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, from the legacy of two Southern Democrats to a raft of new state laws, we examine the latest political headlines with local government expert Chris Hand. Then, turning agricultural leftovers into healthy food assistance, we talk to local gleaners about their literal labor of love. And we talk to a Jacksonville artist about the inspiration behind her new exhibit, Objects of Innocence. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. At least 3 big wildfires in the Los Angeles area are burning out of control. The Eaton fire started last night, and it has already burned more than 2,000 acres. Thousands of people have been told to evacuate in the Pasadena-Altadena area. That includes NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory that's nearby. Another fire is the Palisades Fire burning northwest of L.A. That scorched about 3,000 acres. Cherise Wallace lives in the area and is one of the thousands of people told to flee. But the fire erupted so quickly, she says people are having trouble getting out.
At the bottom of the canyon, there was cars piled on top of each other. There was boulders and debris that fell off of off the canyon that was on fire, that was in the middle of the road where people had to abandon their cars.
A third blaze is the Hearst Fire burning north of Los Angeles. That also broke out late last night, but people have already been forced to flee as it has scorched 500 acres and is growing. The Justice Department has announced it is suing 6 of the nation's largest landlords. NPR's Windsor Johnston reports the lawsuit comes as housing costs continue to go up across the country and many Americans struggle to pay their rent.
The Justice Department has filed an amended complaint in its antitrust lawsuit against RealPage, a property management software company that provides technology platforms for the rental housing industry. The lawsuit accuses the property companies of taking part in a scheme to set their rents using each other's competitively sensitive information through common pricing algorithms. The companies being sued include Cushman & Wakefield and Greystar Real Estate Partners. Collectively, the companies named in the suit operate more than 1.3 million units in 43 states and the District of Columbia. Windsor Johnston, NPR News, Washington.
Donald Trump Jr. is visiting Greenland, the autonomous territory of Denmark that his father wants to buy. Terry Schultz reports the Danish government is trying to put an end to any speculation about that.
Donald Trump Jr. says this was a private visit and that he wasn't meeting Greenlandic government officials. Greenlanders have not taken kindly to the president-elect's declaration that their country must become part of the U.S. The island is home to a U.S. military base in a location strategically important for missile defense. In any case, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen says it's not for sale. Greenland is a very, very proud people. It's a language. It's a culture, she told Denmark's TV2. It's a population which is its own. At a press conference, President-elect Trump reiterated that he believed the U.S. needs control of Greenland for economic security. For NPR News, I'm Terry Schultz.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It's now 9:04. During her 39-year career at Nice High School in Ponte Vedra Beach, former girls basketball coach Sherry Anthony led her team to more than 700 wins. She retired last year, and now the basketball court where she coached so many games has her name on it. Coach Anthony was joined this past weekend by fellow coaches and former students to celebrate the official dedication of the Sherry Anthony Court at Nice. She hopes her name on the basketball court will inspire future players.
I hope that when these kids come through here and they see my name on the floor, they'll say, that was a person of integrity. That was a person that was committed and was passionate, was loyal, was dedicated to one school and one school only.
Anthony didn't last long in retirement. These days, she's working as an assistant coach at the Bowles School in Jacksonville, coaching alongside one of her former players. A statewide grand jury convened at the request of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has found no evidence of criminal activity concerning COVID-19 vaccines. In a final report unsealed yesterday, the grand jury recommended policy changes, including increasing transparency around clinical trials and banning advertisements for pharmaceutical drugs. Federal officials maintain the shots are safe, effective, and are continuously monitored. DeSantis sought the investigation in 2022 ahead of his bid for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. At the time, the governor said the probe would bring legal accountability to those who committed misconduct. Highs in the mid-50s today in Jacksonville.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Lilly Endowment, a private foundation supporting NPR's coverage of religion and spirituality, and Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, the recent deaths of former Governor Buddy McCay and President Jimmy Carter evoke memories of a very different political era in Florida and Georgia. We discuss their legacy at a time of political transformation. Later in the program, a literal harvest of hope. We talk to local gleaners about fighting hunger 1 acre at a time. But first, I'm joined, as I am each month, by attorney and local government expert Chris Hand to discuss the political news of the day. Good morning, Chris.
Happy New Year, Ann.
Happy New Year. It's so nice to have you back in 2025. There's been a lot of news recently that's sort of dominated by history. Certainly, the death of Jimmy Carter has a lot of people recalling a very different political era.
Well, it certainly does, and you think back to, as you do, we do retrospectives on previous years, and 2024 hugely impactful in that Floridians saw the passing of three figures who were really sort of towering figures politically and governmentally. In April, former Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham passed away, and in December, both former President Jimmy Carter and former Florida Governor and U.S. Representative Buddy McCay, three figures who left a huge imprint on both the state and in different ways on the nation, all sort of transitioned in 2024.
And they represent a time when Southern Democrats had electability in a way that they really don't, certainly in the legislatures in Florida and Georgia currently, and really in the governorships of those states currently. What do you see about their era? I mean, what has been so transformational that the time that they held in office seems like such a bygone era?
Well, I think characterized by a number of reasons, and I'll separate them a little bit because obviously Jimmy Carter was from Georgia and Bob Graham and Buddy McCay were from Florida. In the case of Governors Graham and McCay, both came up in the Florida legislature in the late 1960s and the 1970s during a profound reform era in Florida politics. I think both recognized, and I had the great privilege to be able to work with and learn from both of them during my own career. Both came up during an era where Florida began to grow very rapidly. The 1970s was really an explosive growth period in the state, fueled by a variety of factors. And by the way, if you ever asked either Bob Graham or Buddy McCay what those factors were, they could give a very cogent, very fascinating sort of analysis of what that was. But they were there, sort of present at the creation of the modern Florida. And both were part of a generation of public officials who paid very much a close attention to that growth, tried to look ahead to the future and modernize Florida, modernize its government, modernize its economy, figure out how state government could better serve its citizens in what was going to be a very different era for Florida. So the 1970s in the legislature were a period of great reform and forward progress in the state of Florida. And both of them, again, Bob Graham and Buddy McCay, really at the forefront of that in their time in public service. In a similar way, Jimmy Carter did the same in the state of Georgia. He was elected governor of Georgia in 1970, served a single term. In his inaugural address in January of 1971, declared that the era of racial discrimination in Georgia was over. And again, really trying to set a tone for what at the time was called the New South, a time where politicians were appealing to a broad base of constituents, regardless of their racial background, and trying to move their states into the future. So what was happening in Florida with Bob Graham and Buddy McCay, and what was happening in Georgia with Jimmy Carter, there were a lot of parallels of two states that were growing, elected officials who were trying to grapple with that growth and move those states into modern eras.
And both, all three men representing, a progressive agenda, but one that somehow still appealed to very conservative Southerners.
Well, that's right. I think all three of them characterized by their moderate bipartisan politics. Let's take for example Governor McCay. He was in the legislature, but then from 1982 to 1988, he served as a member of the U.S. Congress. One of his big issues, he had a very moderate voting record there, and one of his big issues was federal budget reform, an issue on which he attracted a lot of bipartisan support, worked across the aisle to help move that forward. So I think each of them were characterized in many ways during their rises to their respective levels for moderate solutions, bipartisanship, kind of maintaining the center of the political system. I think that was the key to all three of them being successful in different ways. Again, two became Florida governors, one became a governor and a U.S. senator, and of course, in the case of President Carter, who the country is formally saying goodbye to tomorrow at his funeral services, became President of the United States, the 39th president.
Those policies that they advocated for, in a lot of ways have been pushed back or moved to the margins. And some of them were almost immediately rolled back. I mean, you think of the solar panels that Jimmy Carter installed on the White House, removed by his successor rather quickly. But there was also just a much greater focus, certainly by the former president, on individual sacrifices for environmental reasons. I mean, I remember myself being in school when the school temperature couldn't be set and the air conditioner couldn't be lower than 78 degrees in public buildings. I remember that era. And he also mandated a 65-degree heat limit threshold in the, very chilly day today. We can all kind
Sounds
of,
pretty good today, Ann. Yeah.
but that was a pretty radical move to, that was during the oil embargo when, of course, there was a lot of efforts at, trying to rein in our use of foreign oil.
Well, I think if you look at Jimmy Carter's presidency, there's a lot of examples of where he was significantly ahead of his time, kind of looking down the field, understanding the issues the country was going to have to grapple with. Energy might be the best example. Obviously, in the 1970s, when he became president, the United States had been on the receiving end of multiple oil embargoes. As you say, there was an energy crisis. People from that era remember the long gas lines, the difficulty and the cost in obtaining fuel for vehicles and other purposes. And so that's why, as you say, he did put solar panels on the White House, created the Department of Energy to kind of help the country sort of manage through that process. So he was very much ahead of his time. We see how much we use both solar and electric today, whether it's in vehicles or other forms of electricity generation. Jimmy Carter was really one of the pioneers in that era from a public policy standpoint. Again, was in office from 1977 to 1981, but I think today we're seeing some of the fruits of those early investments he made in some of these alternative fuel technologies.
I just want to correct myself a little bit with characterizing the threshold for the thermostat as radical. I mean, we should note that President Nixon before him set a similar threshold. It was just a little higher. It was 68 degrees instead of 65 degrees. So, I mean, at the time, that idea of mandating in public buildings a temperature that was going to be required wasn't completely brand new.
Right. Well, and again, it I think reflects the time and that in that difficult period. Obviously, we've gone through a period of inflation in the last several years, and one of the areas that was a matter of great concern were energy costs, and those were very valid concerns as people were paying more at the pump than they had in the past. But I think it does sometimes help to put these issues in historical perspective, and those who were around in the 1970s will remember just what an energy crisis that was, both in terms of at that point OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, having embargoes that significantly increased the prices of gas in this country and limited its availability, even during the period of inflation, where, again, like I said, very understandable concerns about the cost of energy, but there weren't as many concerns about the availability of fuel. In the 1970s, there were times where people simply couldn't get gas for their vehicles because of some of those cutbacks that occurred. So energy was a front and center issue. And I think one of President Carter's legacies will be an effort to put the federal government on the forefront of regulating energy, developing energy technologies, all the things that the Energy Department has done since its creation during his presidency.
I'm curious. I mean, we know that times have changed dramatically in terms of the political, I guess, center and also the political fortunes of Southern Democrats. I wonder if you think if there is a time at which Democrats regain a foothold, if they will resemble those kinds of leaders that we're talking about, or if it will be a very new kind of Democrat that is able to be competitive.
Well, I think there's a reason that all of them were successful, which is that they were able to appeal beyond their own kind of natural political base. As you know, I worked for Senator Bob Graham and wrote 2 books with him and spent a lot of time with him kind of going around the state of Florida. And he did not have a partisan lens in what he did, both from a governing and a political standpoint. I mean, he truly wanted to represent Floridians regardless of party. I know from my time, I was a student of Buddy McCay's. I was his research assistant. He had a very similar frame as well in his outlook. I think that is really the key, getting beyond one's political base and providing assurance to voters that you're not just about a single party or ideology, but you're looking out for the interests of all Floridians, that you're paying attention not just to, if you happen to be a Democrat, as given the example you used, you're not just paying attention to Democrats, you're keenly attuned to the concerns of no party affiliation voters and to Republican voters as well, because in your governing approach, you want to make sure to represent everyone. I think that style is not gone out of fashion and is something that people would be well advised to replicate. And we see that right now. One southern state where Democrats still have a variety of key positions is the state of North Carolina, where Governor Roy Cooper is leaving office. Josh Stein is the new governor of North Carolina. North Carolina also elected other statewide officials like a new attorney general who are Democrats. All of them, whether it's Governor Cooper, whether it's Governor Stein, whether it's Attorney General Jackson there, and other key officials, all come from that sort of moderate, centrist, reaching beyond their own political base tradition. So it's not just something from the 1970s and 1980s. We still see the success of that approach today.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to attorney and government expert Chris Hand about the latest statewide and government headlines. You can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We have a call now from Don in North Jacksonville. Good morning, Don. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I had a question, a comment in terms of President Carter, his legacy, being considered a good man overall. He's never demonized like you see in the media, or right-wing media. They demonize Obama or Biden as bad, as woke, as evil. And there's always a tendency to have a respect for President Carter. And I'd like to hear your take on that, why there's such a level of respect for him even though he's also Democrat. And the question that I have is, how do you feel about the creation of the Department of Energy and the Department of Education under Carter, and how effective it has been through the decades, in your opinion, counting that the current president-elect wants to maybe abolish them?
Thank you, Don.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Well, first of all, remember that President Carter came from a very different era, politically speaking, where I think there was less personal demonization. But I think part of the bipartisan respect that he has engendered, it's very interesting to look at his career because I think it's very different than a lot of other former presidents. President Carter obviously did not receive a second term when he applied for one, but he did sort of decide he wanted to have a second chance at making a public impact. So I think of all the ex-presidents, he certainly ranks at or near the top of those who had an impact in their post-presidency. Obviously, he had one of the longest post-presidencies and one of the most productive, obviously in creating the Carter Center and the efforts they made around the world to eradicate disease and try to bring peace to war-torn areas and help support democracy through the election monitoring they did. And here domestically, the work he did with Habitat for Humanity. He wrote countless books in the time since he left. So he was one of the most engaged former presidents following the time he left, and I think really modeled what it was to be not just a citizen of the United States, but also a citizen of the world. So I think that post-presidency really did build a lot of bipartisan support. And like a lot of former presidents, for example, he and his former opponent in 1976, former President Gerald Ford, became fast friends during their respective post-presidencies. So I think that is a big reason for the respect he earned and the reason you're seeing bipartisan tributes. It will be interesting to track in the new administration. Our caller's correct. There have been suggestions, as there have been in years past, to abolish the Department of Education and the Department of Energy. We'll see if that's part of some of the early legislative efforts. My sense is that Republicans in Congress have some higher priorities than that. And there are some very important functions that both departments fulfill. We talked some earlier about the Department of Energy and what that does. The Department of Education obviously provides a lot of support to educational institutions, including higher educational institutions around the country, has a huge role in the student loan process. So there are crucial functions that both the U.S. Department of Energy and U.S. Department of Education perform. They're not easily dismantled, and any such dismantling could have very significant cascading effects in states and communities around the country. So I can't speak for the Republican leadership in Congress, but from the early signs we're seeing, it looks like they are going to have higher priorities than the dismantling of those two departments. But we'll have to see, of course, what the external effort, the Department of Governmental Efficiency that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are leading, what that leads to. But there have been efforts and talks about abolishing those departments in the past, and I think when the rubber has hit the road, people have backed off those efforts, knowing what the important functions those departments provide.
It is a new era, though, in the sense that we are seeing at least a lot of proposed political appointments to agencies of people who don't believe in those agencies or have been critical of the mission of those agencies. And it does seem like a different landscape.
No question about it. And again, that's one of the sort of novelties of this era that we'll have to track and see what how that works over time. But just remember that with any of these agencies, the agencies themselves, they're not an island. They receive oversight from the U.S. Congress. They receive appropriations from the U.S. Congress. So it's not just a function of a new president coming in and being able to decide on his own whether or not those departments stick around or not. There's a huge role for Congress. Remember that right now, that while President Trump's party now has a 53-47 margin in the Senate, they have a very, very tiny 3-seat margin in the U.S. House of Representatives, which I think is going to make massive change much more difficult than maybe some anticipate.
We've got a call from Stanley on the north side. Good morning, Stanley. Go ahead.
Yes, Happy New Year's to you and Chris. My point here, Chris are doing a fantastic job. But my issue here, but my concern is the fact that Carter and the governor operated from the bottom up, not top down, where they were more concerned about ethics and the quality of life for people. And that was embedded in them, not politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Stanley.
Well, I think that's certainly true, and that from some of the people we talked about earlier, Buddy McCay, Jimmy Carter, Bob Graham, high ethical standards, really believe very strongly in making sure the government was on the side of and serving citizens and giving them a high quality of life. What I'm also struck with, and thinking about Governor McCay, who just passed away on December 31st, and will be laid to rest next week in Ocala, the city where he was born and the area where he passed away, just how much impact they all continued to have following their passing. Like I said, I was particularly engaged with Senator Graham after his retirement, but each of those leaders, in Buddy McCay's case, he served as governor for a brief period after Lawton Childs passed away in office. Yeah, for 23 days. Had been a very, probably, I think, arguably the most effective lieutenant governor in the state's history when Governor Childs was in office, had been in Congress, but stayed so engaged in many years. And I think, to Stanley's point, one thing that distinguished all these people was how grounded they were. After Buddy McCay left the governor's office, President Clinton appointed him as the special envoy to the Americas, and then he continued to serve in ways that didn't always make headlines. He was a teacher at the University of Florida, Levin College of Law. He was a family court mediator in Ocala. He wrote op-eds. He tried to make sure issues stayed on the public radar screen. What's interesting to me about these three towering figures who have now passed on is they did not need the trappings of office in order to stay engaged publicly and continue to do their part in that most important role as citizen to try and kind of move their areas forward. And I think that really distinguished all of these towering figures, that the end of their time in office did not end their time in public service, and they continued working both in ways that were visible and many ways that were not as visible to try and fulfill the mission they launched when they started their political careers.
I want to move on now to talk about some other issues in the state, particularly some new laws here in Florida that took effect January 1st. I think the most significant is this social media ban that has taken effect. Tell us a little bit about what it provides for, what it requires of social media companies, and kind of its status right now.
Well, this is obviously something that is a subject of some litigation, but essentially what this would do creates a social media ban for people under the age of 16 in the state of Florida. If one is 14 or 15, they can participate in social media with some parental consent, but under the age of 14 is a total ban. And there's some, a variety of different sort of regulations that come along with this. This is going to be, already is, the subject of significant litigation here in the state with social media companies and others citing First Amendment concerns. Obviously, people who are advocates of this legislation citing concerns about the potential impact they're concerned that social media might have on teenagers, both in terms of time and in terms of content. So this will be not only sort of an important piece of legislation, but also an important segment of litigation to watch over 2025 to see how the courts decide what power the state of Florida and, by extension, other states have to regulate social media usage.
And this is, I guess, the most aggressive social media law currently on the books, but it is not going to be immediately. I guess the people who are suing over it have asked for an injunction, and that hearing is going to be in February. But in the meantime, the Attorney General has said she's not going to enforce.
That's right. Attorney General Ashley Moody has said that, and I think the hearing is toward the end of February. She is going to hold on enforcing that part of the law until the federal court, it's set in the Northern District of Florida, has a chance to weigh in on, whether or not the claims that are being brought by some of these social media companies have merit. This doesn't necessarily affect all social media. There's a somewhat long definition of social media in the legislation. So it's not every social media company that's joined in this litigation. It's several of them. But that'll be a key hearing as the federal court decides whether or not there are grounds to move forward with this lawsuit and whether or not the plaintiffs are entitled to some sort of injunction. We'll have to watch and see. But it's significant legislation and litigation that follows some concerns about the impact of social media on young people, again,
Sure.
both in terms of time invested and in content. So could be a ruling that has ramifications for years to come.
As you noted, it's February 28th that hearing is set for. How quickly do you think? I mean, this is a request for an injunction. So do judges typically move pretty quickly when that's the issue?
Well, one of the factors you have to show to receive injunctive relief is to show irreparable harm, and so there often is some urgency in people moving for an injunction. My guess is the court will rule rather quickly on the request for injunctive relief, because again, requests for injunctive relief are by their very nature almost emergencies. These are very sort of short term. We need you to, court, please stop this particular behavior because of the harm that it's going to do to us. So those are often on an accelerated schedule. The underlying substance of the litigation, whether or not the law is constitutional or not, that will undoubtedly take longer for the court to resolve.
And certainly one of the objections to this law and the way that it's going to be implemented, at least according to one of the people that is impacted, which is one of the largest like pornography websites in probably the world, is their contention that in order to validate someone's age, that they'd be required to have a customer upload their government ID as proof of age and in order to demonstrate adult consent, which they say raises privacy concerns. I think very obviously would, given how frequently websites are hacked.
Well, I think that'll be one of the issues that's sort of hashed out in the litigation itself. How the court balances sort of concerns about privacy versus the state's overall sort of power to sort of regulate commerce, sort of protect people who are not of the age of 18. So I think that is those are some of the variety of questions that the courts will grapple with. And this litigation has been filed in Florida. This is not the last piece of litigation we've seen on this issue. This is going to be an issue that tracks, I think, from state to state. I think one of the things that'll be interesting to watch is as other states move in this direction as well, which I think is possible, to what extent does Congress and the federal government ultimately decide to weigh in and try and set some sort of national standard in that regard?
I've been interested in this idea in the state of Florida because there have been a number of sort of First Amendment related issues that have been passed as laws, ranging from the kind of stop woke, what you can teach or what you can require employees to, listen to in terms of instruction. This case, they're talking about this is more a technological restriction. So it's, designed to stop sort of scrolling,
Right.
brain rot type, technology from bothering kids or from, impacting kids, as opposed to being a free speech infringement. And sort of in the stop woke, um, discussion, they were saying this is a conduct matter, the conduct of a company requiring their employees to listen to certain kinds of training. It's not about the free speech of the company. And so is that new, that sort of finding new ways to, impact speech, but doing it through means that are sort of trying to separate themselves from First Amendment issues?
Well, the body of law surrounding the First Amendment, and as you know, is sort of ever evolving, and really has been for centuries. I mean, basically since the beginning of jurisprudence in this country, there have been a variety of sort of evolving standards as it relates to the First Amendment. And you are correct. Now that sort of the debate over the First Amendment and the scope and interpretation of the First Amendment has kind of moved sort of to a new area, and I think there are new efforts to sort of reimagine and reinterpret sort of what the First Amendment's guarantees provide. As you say, here in the state of Florida, we've seen numerous examples in recent years of legislation that has been challenged on First Amendment grounds, some of which has been overturned or stopped from taking effect. So that's going to be an area going forward in this sort of technological world in which we live, and where human beings have more powers to communicate and more powers of expression than maybe they ever have at any point in human history. Defining which of those are protected and which of those aren't going to be a fascinating legal issue moving forward.
We've got a call from Devin in Atlantic Beach. Good morning, Devin. Go ahead.
Hello. Y'all were talking about the Department of Education earlier, And I was wondering, considering the statistics of American children falling behind relative to other Western countries, in addition to this imposition of new math that takes away the actual skill of math of the critical thinking, what do you all think the DOE has provided to the educational system that has actually done work?
Thanks, Devin. Your thoughts, Chris?
Well, thanks for the question. A lot of the work you're describing actually occurs at the state level. So the issue of setting forth educational standards, designing curriculum, approving textbooks, obviously hiring teachers, some of that work is done at all 50 states. So we really have almost 50 different educational standards. The work of the federal government has largely been from the Department of Education. Yes, they provide at times, like, for example, when George W. Bush was president and they passed the No Child Left Behind Act, that sort of, provided a role for the federal government in sort of being of support. When President Obama was in office, the Race to the Top initiative used, like President Bush did, some incentives to help encourage states to adopt certain practices. But the federal Department of Education really doesn't run the business of public education in this country day to day. Like I said earlier, they do things like provide support for higher education institutions, make sure that educational systems are not discriminating on the basis of race or gender or other factors. They play a huge role in providing student loans and managing the student loan program. So they do a lot of key work, but what they don't necessarily do is reach in on a daily basis and regulate individual states and school districts. They have some role in that, but their role is really at a much sort of higher, think of it from a air traffic control tower. They're kind of at a 35,000-foot level on the education system, not in that granular system that states or local school districts like the Duval County Public Schools where they exist.
So I want to just briefly touch on this new HALO law because I do want to get to the garbage fee issue here in Jacksonville. But just briefly, if you can, this is the law that would require, when instructed, people at a scene where police are to step back 25 feet. It's called the HALO law. It's designed to protect first responders if they feel threatened.
That's right. So the law would, for when someone is told not to approach a law enforcement officer or a first responder of any kind, and if they, penetrate that 25 feet boundary, it would make that a second-degree misdemeanor here in the state. And the, intent of the drafters of that law was to provide protection to first responders. There has been some concern and criticism raised, particularly by civil libertarians, about whether that is designed to impact, again, people's First Amendment right to protest or those sorts of things. But it would, again, it sets up a 25 feet boundary. If someone's told not to approach a first responder, they come closer than 25 feet. It would make that a second-degree misdemeanor. And again, the idea is to safeguard first responders who, of course, are doing life-saving and life-changing work, whether it's firefighters and rescue personnel or obviously police or law enforcement officers.
Okay, and I'm going to be, interested in this next topic because this garbage fee that's proposed by Councilmember Matt Carlucci. He's actually going to be on the program Monday, talking about it ahead of the formal introduction of this legislation. But basically, it would increase the garbage fee in Jacksonville by, more than double. It would go from $12.65 a month to $30.40 a month. This is going to be a lively debate for sure.
It definitely is. And as we know, garbage fees and garbage fee debates have a long history in Jacksonville. In fact, there was a former mayor, Tommy Hazouri, who probably did not win re-election because of his administration's proposal to institute a garbage fee in the late 1980s when he was mayor during a budget crisis, which the city of Jacksonville is about to be in again. The city of Jacksonville, into the brief history, and in 2008, as you know, the city of Jacksonville imposed 3 fees: a solid waste fee, a stormwater fee, and a JEA franchise fee. That solid waste fee, or that garbage fee, was increased in 2010. It was supposed to be adjusted on an annual basis going forward, depending on what the cost of the service was going to be. but City Council, through a variety of actions, has not increased the fee since 2010. So for 15 years, the fee has remained flat. Well, what has not remained flat is the cost the city pays for providing solid waste services. Obviously, part of the city is served by City of Jacksonville employees, but much, or frankly, most of the city is served by private waste haulers who contract with the city to provide those services. Well, to no one's surprise, between 2010 and 2025, the cost of providing those services and what the waste haulers have charged has continued to go up. So that fee, that $12.65 cent fee, no longer supports those particular
Not
costs.
even close.
Yeah. So what the city's been doing is we pay for all of our solid waste through sort of a special account. It's called the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund. What the city's been doing is taking money from the general fund, the fund that pays for law enforcement or firefighters or parks or public works, and essentially subsidizing that solid waste enterprise fund to make up for the deficit there. That amount has been steadily growing to the point where in this upcoming fiscal year, that amount's going to be $100 million.
Wow.
That's a very significant portion of the budget.
I just want to briefly ask you, because some people say, why not just put this fee in the, get rid of the fee, pay for it out of the general fund?
Well, that is an option that some have recommended. I'll be curious to see if that is talked about in the debate. I think the challenge with that is in 2008, when that fee was approved, the idea was to have solid waste out of the general fund and in its own category, supported by these sort of user fees, so that it didn't compete with other priorities that were in the general fund, whether that's first responders, parks, public works, some of these other things that local governments do. I'm sure that idea will come up and be discussed again. I think one of the areas where that's going to that debate's going to become significant is City of Jacksonville is about to run some very significant deficits. The council auditor during last year's budget process projected deficits for the next 5 fiscal years, and some of those deficits are going to be very significant. In fact, in a couple of those out years in the future, they're projecting deficits of more than $100 million. So I think that is going to be one of the points of consideration for the idea of kind of moving solid waste back into the overall operational budget. But practically speaking, Ann, it's almost there already because of the amount of money the operational budget's having to spend right now to kind of make up those gaps caused by the difference in the fee and the cost of the services.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Chris Hand, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
I'll look forward to seeing you soon, Ann.
All right,
Thanks.
terrific. Up in addition, with new significance at a time of growing food insecurity. Here to talk about the work of gleaning is Linda Deshauteurs and David Hollingshead. They're both volunteer field supervisors with the Society of St. Andrew. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Good morning. Thank
Good
you.
morning. I'm so glad to have you. So you've both volunteered as gleaners for the past 8 years. Linda, tell us what that is for people who aren't familiar.
Okay, well, gleaning is originally a biblical term where God kind of said, farmers, when you harvest, leave the edges unharvested so those who are in need could come in and feed their families. And the Society of St. Andrews has taken that to heart for, about 50 years or so, where they have developed a network of farmers who are willing to let volunteers come in after they harvest and pick what's left in the field. So basically, with farming, God bless farmers, because that's a hard business. And when Mother Nature's ready to roll, the stuff that's left in the field that they couldn't get to, that's not available for sale or can't be sold because of cosmetic reasons, it either rots or gets plowed under. So the Society of St. Andrews has gotten together farmers across the United States and volunteers, and we just get together and get it done.
Yeah. And David, how did you get involved in doing this, you and Linda?
Well, the way we got involved is originally we both worked for big banks here in Charlotte. I'm sorry, based out of Charlotte that were located here in Jacksonville. And they had volunteer groups, and they would do various things. And one of the things they did was going and picking people's citrus here around town. And then they would donate that to food banks. And so that kind of piqued my interest in it.
And that we should say is when people permit that, right? They say
Exactly,
you're
right,
free to
right.
come pick this
Right,
citrus.
please come. I'm not going to use it. Please come pick it because I hate to see it fall on the ground and go to waste.
Mhm.
And so they would let us come and do that. Well, the Society for St. Andrews does that on a much more broad scale, and primarily they work with commercial farmers. So when we talk about commercial farmers, we talk about the farms that supply the grocery stores and the Publix and the various other grocers that are around the country.
And
And
so when you're going into these fields, I mean, I know that there's huge swaths of, say, southern St. Johns County, southwest
Mhm.
St. Johns County that is still very agricultural. Are you going in there with equipment, or are you just kind of going in there as pedestrians, gathering food in
The
a pouch?
the equipment are our 2 hands, and occasionally, depending on what the produce is that we're harvesting, you may need to have a sharp knife that will cut it. But most of the time, it's just pick it with your bare hands from the stalk.
It sounds like pretty intense labor. And so, how often do you do it, and how?
Well, okay, intense labor. It's much harder than using the remote control and sitting on the couch, but we usually just do it for 2.5, maybe 3 hours tops. We typically go in the morning. It's really not that difficult. If it's too hard for you to get in and bend over and do it, we have a routine. There's a coordinator in the field who also volunteers, and some people will then maybe just pack the bags into the trucks, into the pickup trucks that come to take it back to the food pantries. There are some people like David and myself. We're very fortunate to be healthy in our retirement, and we go in and God, there's nothing better than when we were doing it during COVID. There was nothing better than getting out in the field and taking your mask off and breathing the fresh air and the taste of fresh broccoli in the morning.
Yeah. And so, are you harvesting right now?
Okay, so the reason we are so grateful to be on air right now is that there is a very generous farmer, the Smith Family Farms out in Hastings, who we've been working with on and off and has allowed us to come in for the broccoli season. Our first gig, Mother Nature cooperating, hopefully, is on the 20th of January. And we will look to be out in the fields at least once a week through the broccoli season, which is right through April. And God, we learned a lot about broccoli. There's 14 varieties of broccoli that allow them to continue to grow as the weather gets warmer here in Jacksonville. So last year, we did nearly 14,000 pounds based on, I think, 10 weeks in a row.
That's just here in Jacksonville.
Well, yeah, so 14,000 pounds came out of the Smith Farms.
Where does that food go then?
Well, so this is great. Volunteers come from 3 counties with pickup trucks or panel trucks. They come from places like Epic Cure, which is a food pantry in Palatka. And there's one in St. John's that comes with his white pickup truck. I only know these people by first names. And then there are people who come for their churches and their local organizations. Like I said, Clay County, St. John's County, Duval County.
So, just briefly, if people do want to volunteer, how can they get involved?
Okay, so we're actually here to make an appeal, not just for individual volunteers. And if you're available on Monday the 20th, or you have the flexibility, we have a website. Society St. Andrews website is endhunger.org. Look for the volunteer and go way down to the bottom, and you'll find a little dot that represents Jacksonville, and you can sign up for Hastings. The other appeal we're making is to churches and other organizations who have food pantries and can send out a crew and a vehicle and come fill it up.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. We'll have to leave it there. Linda Deshauteurs, David Hollingshead, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you so much.
And we'll be right back just in a minute with a new exhibit that opens in downtown Jacksonville.
Mayo Clinic, working to treat the untreatable by developing personalized cancer vaccines that stimulate the immune system to better treat the disease and help prevent it from recurring. More at mayoclinic.org/Florida.
On January 10th and 11th, Robert Spano conducts the Marcus Roberts Trio and the Jacksonville Symphony for Gershwin's Concerto in F, Tchaikovsky's Fifth, and more. Visit jacksymphony.org.
Visionary musician and artist Brian Eno, producer for David Bowie, U2, and Talking Heads, pioneered ambient music and redefined creativity. Now, step into his world with Eno, a film exploring his creative process, and is shortlisted for this year's Oscars. See Eno on January 22nd at WJCT Studios. Visit wjct.org/events for tickets.
On the next Fresh Air, Oscar winner Tilda Swinton talks about death, grief, her love of costumes and androgynous style, and why she doesn't think of herself as an actor. In The Room Next Door, Swinton portrays a woman who has suffered from cancer and after therapies haven't worked, intends to end her life. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
This week, our series .gov is unpacking the role of dozens of federal agencies in our lives and what the new administration has planned for them and the people who keep them running. Next up, the Department of Health and Human Services, the agency responsible for the health of the American public and the changes we could see to it. Next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, a new exhibit opens in Jacksonville this week, exploring nostalgia and healing. Here to talk about the exhibit is the artist behind it. It's called Objects of Innocence. We welcome back Elena Olander. Thanks for being here.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. So this is a new solo exhibition. What inspired it, and what themes are you exploring in the work?
Sure. Over the summer, I had the opportunity to visit Japan for 3 months to do an apprenticeship for kintsugi pottery repair. And during that time, I had the opportunity to inspect my relationship with objects. And so when I got back, I decided to imbue my two-dimensional works, my paintings, with this relationship with objects, particularly of child's play.
And you talk about kintsugi. Am I saying that correctly?
Kintsugi, yes.
So that is a kind of the art of restoring broken pottery. Tell us a little bit about that. It's a really interesting practice.
Correct. Yeah, I think that the practice is as much a physical repair as it is a healing journey. And so there's this philosophy that coincides with that in the sense of honoring the object and kind of healing not just that piece, but pieces of yourself.
And the idea being that something that's broken, that's repaired, is actually more resilient in those places than it was before.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
I'm curious though. I mean, is the pottery like, do you break it first and then repair it?
Ideally, not so much to break it intentionally, but if it is broken by accident, that's the best approach, is to repair it through that process.
And so, the idea of, emotion and healing is a theme also in this new exhibit.
That's right.
But it also has a lot to do with kind of childhood nostalgia, play. Talk about how you are incorporating those themes and why you're exploring them.
Sure. I think it's about my filial relationship with my daughter, and she's now 14 and in high school. But through this experience to bear witness of her coming of age, I felt that I was able to kind of have a relationship that healed me as well in my own personal childhood traumas and moving through recovery. So seeing her curiosity and wonder filled something in me. And so those objects kind of typify that
Yeah.
recovery.
And you say that you were recently in Japan. You explore themes also of cultural identity in your work. And you are Asian and also, I guess, Norwegian.
That's correct.
And so how is that reflected in your work? I mean, how do you explore those themes?
I think right now, although I have a cultural nuance that's specific to Japan, my daughter is half Japanese, so I kind of explore those cultural nuances, but I think it transcends to this idea of like nostalgia, joy, recovery, and curiosity.
And so we're actually able to see some of your artwork. Our
Oh, great.
director is putting them on the screen right now for people who are interested to see. You're going to be speaking at the opening of this exhibit. What is it that you're going to be addressing when you're talking to people who come to the show?
I think I want to just open a dialogue that's about this relationship with objects and the healing journey and what that investigation really looks like for me personally, but also kind of exploring how others approach
Is
that.
there like a particular object that you could sort of explain what you're talking about when you talk about your relationship with it?
Um, there are toys that I think we play with, or even just the act of creating a painting or drawing. To me, that was a catharsis for my childhood, is to spend time really like drawing and playing and really living in a world of imagination.
And
So,
your work also incorporates some elements of kind of Japanese pop culture, manga, anime, and there is a real whimsy and very colorful work as well.
yeah, I think that there is a dichotomy between whimsy and darkness. There's this black background that kind of alludes to an abyss. And sometimes that's how the journey can feel, is it's, not directional or linear, but, it is about the journey more than the destination.
You have work, I mean, you're a muralist as well. You've got pieces at Wynwood, several of them. You've got a mural at the Phoenix Arts and Innovation District here.
Yes.
And you've done a number of murals just at businesses around the state. But for people who haven't, seen your work previously, how can they see it? How can they participate in the upcoming show?
Well, they can attend the show this Friday evening at the Lark. It's such a wonderful venue and
That's on
space.
Hogan Street, downtown Jacksonville.
That's correct.
Okay.
And my website is elenaolander.com. And if you come visit Phoenix Arts District in Springfield area, it is truly a special space. There's murals all about, and my studio is also there in that space.
All right. Well, Elena Olander, it's nice to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Likewise, thank you so much.
And that's our program. Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback or suggestions, you can send either to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. If you missed anything, you can catch our rebroadcast at 8 o'clock tonight, or you can find our entire archive on your favorite podcast platform. Join us tomorrow when we sit down with State Attorney Melissa Nelson on the inception of her third term. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
In Penn, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congaree&penn.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com.